Every night, I cleaned the deserted halls of a Vermont hospital. But what I stumbled upon, a secret log detailing the facility's most unsettling rules, changed everything. Forget no running in the halls. We're talking no entry zones on an abandoned fourth floor where whispers never truly die. Prepare yourself. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. My name is Ethan Cole, and 3 weeks ago, I thought I had landed the easiest job of my life. Greenwood Memorial Hospital sat nestled in the foothills of the Green Mountains, a sprawling brick building that had served the small community of Hollow Creek since 1923. The position was simple enough: night shift custodian, 11 at night until 7 in the morning. The pay was surprisingly generous for janitorial work, almost suspiciously so, but I was a 28-year-old man with mounting student debt and a recently foreclosed apartment. I was in no position to ask questions. The interview had been strange, now that I think back on it. The hospital administrator, a thin woman named Patricia Wells with silver streaked hair, pulled into a severe bun, had spent more time asking about my ability to follow instructions than my actual cleaning experience. She had looked at me with pale gray eyes that seemed to bore straight through my skull. "The night shift here requires a particular temperament, Mr. Cole," she had said, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. "We need someone who can follow rules precisely. Not approximately. Not mostly. Precisely. Can you do that?" I had nodded, eager to secure employment. "Absolutely. I'm very detail-oriented." She had smiled then, but it never reached her eyes. "Good. Because in this hospital, especially after midnight, the rules exist for a reason. Breaking them has consequences." I should have paid more attention to the weight behind her words. My first week passed without incident. The hospital was smaller than most, only 4 floors with 2 active wings. The 3rd floor housed the administrative offices and storage, while the first 2 floors contained the emergency department, surgical suites, and patient rooms. The 4th floor, I was told during my orientation, was closed. It had been the psychiatric ward decades ago, but budget cuts and changing regulations had shuttered it in the late 1980s. The elevator did not even have a button for it anymore. "Just forget the 4th floor exists," my supervisor, a heavy-set man named Gerald, had told me on my first night. "You never go up there. You never think about going up there. As far as you're concerned, this building only has 3 floors." It was an odd instruction, but I accepted it. Every workplace had its quirks. The nights fell into a rhythm. I would start in the emergency department, mopping the floors and sanitizing the waiting area. Then I would move through the surgical wing, emptying trash and restocking supply closets. By 2 in the morning, I would be working through the patient corridors on the 2nd floor, moving quietly so as not to disturb those trying to heal. The hospital was rarely full. Hollow Creek was a small town, and most nights there were perhaps a dozen patients scattered throughout the building. It was during my 2nd week that I began to notice the peculiarities. The first thing that struck me as strange was the night nursing staff. They moved through the corridors with an unusual urgency, their eyes constantly darting to the shadows. They rarely spoke to me, but when they did, their voices were hushed, almost conspiratorial. One nurse, a middle-aged woman named Helen Morse, pulled me aside one night near the supply closet. "You're new," she said, her grip on my arm surprisingly firm. "How are you finding the nights?" "Fine," I replied, somewhat taken aback by her intensity. "Quiet mostly." She nodded slowly, her eyes flickering toward the ceiling. "Good. Let's hope they stay that way. Remember, Mr. Cole, when things get unusual around here, the best thing you can do is mind your own business and keep moving." Before I could ask what she meant, she had already disappeared around the corner. The second peculiarity was the sounds. Every old building has its noises, the settling of foundations, the rattling of ancient pipes, but Greenwood Memorial produced sounds that seemed almost deliberate. Some nights, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I would hear what sounded like footsteps echoing from somewhere above me. Slow, measured footsteps that would pace back and forth for hours. This was impossible, of course. There were no patients on the third floor, and the fourth floor was completely abandoned. The third peculiarity, and the one that truly unsettled me, was what happened on my 10th night. I was mopping the corridor near the radiology department when I heard the elevator chime. This was unusual. Most staff used the stairwells at night, and patient transports were rare after midnight. I glanced up to see the elevator doors slide open, revealing an orderly pushing gurney. The orderly was a man I had never seen before, tall and gaunt with deeply sunken eyes. He wore the standard hospital scrubs, but they seemed to hang off his frame like they belonged to someone else. On the gurney lay a figure covered entirely by a white sheet, perfectly still. What caught my attention was not the orderly or the shrouded patient. It was the way the other staff members reacted. Helen Morse had been standing near the nurse's station, and the moment the elevator doors opened, she froze. Her face went pale, and she immediately averted her eyes, staring at the floor with an intensity that suggested she was afraid to look up. Another nurse, a young man I'd seen a few times, actually turned and walked briskly in the opposite direction. The orderly wheeled the gurney past me without a word. As he passed, I felt a wave of cold air wash over me, so intense that I could see my breath misting in front of my face. The temperature in that corridor must have dropped 30 degrees in an instant. And then I heard it, a voice, soft and papery, emanating from beneath the white sheet. "Help me." I stopped mopping. My entire body went rigid. The voice had been barely above a whisper, but in the silent corridor, it had been unmistakable. The orderly did not slow down. He pushed the gurney around a corner and disappeared toward the east wing, where the service elevator was located, the one that still had a button for the fourth floor. I stood there for a long moment, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to follow, to do something. Someone had just asked for help. But when I looked at Helen Morse, she was shaking her head slowly, her eyes still fixed on the floor. "You didn't hear that," she whispered. "Whatever you think you heard, you didn't. Go back to your work, Mr. Cole." That night, I could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with Greenwood Memorial Hospital. It was 3 days later that I found the logbook. I had been assigned to clean out a storage room on the third floor, a forgotten space filled with old equipment and decades of accumulated dust. Filing cabinets lined the walls, most of them empty, their contents long since shredded or transferred elsewhere. I was sweeping behind a row of shelving when I noticed something wedged between the wall and an ancient radiator. It was a leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked and faded with age. When I pulled it free, a small cloud of dust billowed into the air. The spine was worn, and several pages had come loose, but most of it was still intact. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and precise, written in blue ink that had faded to a pale gray. At the top of the page was a name and a date. Bernard Hutchins, night custodian, 1987 to 1998. Below there was a single sentence that made my blood run cold. "If you're reading this, then God help you. You've taken a night shift at Greenwood Memorial, and there are things you need to know if you want to survive." I leaned against the wall, my legs suddenly unsteady. The word survive echoed in my mind. Not succeed, not enjoy, survive. I turned to the next page. What I found was not a diary or a collection of random notes. It was a list, a carefully compiled, meticulously detailed list of rules, each one numbered and followed by explanations and warnings. The handwriting remained steady throughout, suggesting that Bernard Hutchins had been perfectly lucid when he wrote these words. The first rule I read was simple enough. Rule 3. Always carry a flashlight with fresh batteries. The backup generators do not cover all areas of the hospital. But as I continued reading, the rules became increasingly disturbing. Rule 7. Midnight patient transfers. Between the hours of 12 and 3 a.m., you may encounter orderlies transporting patients to and from the fourth floor. Do not make eye contact with the orderlies. Do not speak to them. Do not, under any circumstances, attempt to look beneath the sheets covering the patients. Simply step aside, allow them to pass, and continue your work as if nothing unusual has occurred. The transfers serve a purpose you do not want to understand. I thought of the gurney I had seen, the voice pleading for help from beneath the sheet, the cold that had seeped into my bones. Rule 9. If you hear your name called from an empty room, do not respond. Do not enter the room to investigate. Keep walking and do not look back. It is not someone who needs your help. I had heard my name whispered just last night. I had assumed it was the wind through the ventilation system. Rule 12. The fourth floor is an absolute no-entry zone. This is not a guideline. This is not a suggestion. The fourth floor was sealed in 1989 for reasons that have never been documented in official records. Even if you hear sounds from above, screams, cries, or calls for assistance, you are forbidden from attempting to access the fourth floor. The sounds are not what they seem. The people making them are no longer people. My hands were trembling. I could feel the weight of those words pressing down on me, suffocating in their implications. This was not the ranting of a disturbed mind. The writing was too calm, too measured, too specific. Bernard Hutchins had believed every word he had written. The final entry I read that night was perhaps the most chilling. Rule 19. Locked rooms. Throughout the hospital, you will find rooms that are permanently locked. These locks are never to be tampered with. Never attempt to open a designated locked room, regardless of what you hear from inside. The screams you hear are not coming from victims. They are bait. The things inside those rooms are hungry, and they have learned to mimic human suffering with disturbing accuracy. If you open the door, you will not be able to close it again. Not in time. I closed the logbook and stood there in the darkness of that forgotten storage room, the beam of my flashlight trembling against the wall. What kind of hospital was this? What had I stumbled into? And more importantly, what had happened to Bernard Hutchins, the man who had written these rules? I did not sleep that day. I went home as the sun rose over the Green Mountains, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that gurney being wheeled down the corridor. I heard that papery voice pleading for help. I thought about the fourth floor looming above me every night, sealed away like a wound that refused to heal. When night fell again, I returned to Greenwood Memorial. The logbook was hidden in my locker, but its contents were burned into my memory. I needed to understand what was happening in this place. I needed to know the truth about the rules, and I needed to find out if Bernard Hutchins had survived long enough to write his final entry. Because as I walked through those doors that night, I realized something that made my stomach clench with dread. The logbook had been incomplete. Several pages had been torn out, and the last entry was dated December 17th, 1998. Bernard Hutchins had stopped writing in the middle of the sentence. The second week of January marked my 4th week at Greenwood Memorial Hospital. The logbook never left my thoughts. I kept it hidden in my locker during shifts, afraid that someone might discover I'd found it. But every break I took, every quiet moment I stole, I spent poring over Bernard Hutchins' meticulous entries. The man had been thorough. Between his general rules for survival, he had included personal observations, fragments of conversations he had overheard, and disturbing incidents he had witnessed during his 11 years as a night custodian. Reading through his accounts felt like peeling back layers of a wound that had never properly healed. One entry, dated March 1992, described the night Bernard first witnessed a midnight patient transfer. I was emptying trash in the East Corridor when I heard the elevator he had written. I knew immediately something was wrong. The sound was different, heavier. When the doors opened, I saw them for the first time. 2 orderlies, faces pale as milk, pushing a gurney with a sheet-covered form. I made the mistake of looking at one of them. Our eyes met for perhaps half a second. His eyes were not eyes. They were pits. Empty, hollow pits that seemed to pull at something inside me. I felt my chest tighten, felt a pressure behind my temples that did not ease for 3 days. After that night, I learned to look away. I thought about the orderly I had seen. I had not looked directly into his eyes, but I had glanced at his face. I had noticed how gaunt he was, how wrong his proportions seemed. What would have happened if I had stared longer? Another entry from September 1994 described what Bernard called the whispers. They come from the walls, he wrote, from the ceiling, from the floors. They are not voices in the traditional sense. They are impressions, feelings translated into sound. Sometimes they speak your name. Sometimes they speak in languages that have not been uttered in centuries. The trick is to recognize them for what they are, invitations. They want you to respond. They want you to follow. The moment you engage with them, you become visible. You become a target. I had heard the whispers. I had dismissed them as acoustical quirks, as the sounds of an old building settling into itself. Now I understood that every time I heard my name drifting from an empty room, something was watching, waiting, testing to see if I was foolish enough to answer. But it was Bernard's entries about the 4th floor that truly haunted me. The floor had been a psychiatric ward until 1987, when it was officially closed due to budget constraints. That was the story the hospital told. That was what the public records showed. But Bernard had uncovered a different truth. I found old newspaper clippings in the basement archives. He wrote in an entry from July 1996. The 4th floor was not closed because of money. It was closed because of what happened during the summer of 1986. A doctor named William Cartwright was conducting experimental treatments on patients suffering from severe psychological disorders. The treatments involved isolation, sensory deprivation, and something else. Something that was never recorded in official documents. 12 patients and 3 staff members died over the course of 8 weeks. The bodies were never recovered. Dr. Cartwright himself vanished on the night of August 14, 1986. The hospital sealed the floor the following year and erased all mention of the incident from their records. 12 patients, 3 staff members, 15 people who simply disappeared without a trace. What had Dr. Cartwright been doing on that floor? What experiments had been so terrible that the hospital had chosen to bury them rather than face public scrutiny? I continued reading, searching for answers, but Bernard's entries about the 4th floor grew, increasingly fragmented and paranoid. He described hearing footsteps above him that matched his own. He wrote about seeing shadows passing beneath the stairwell door, shadows that moved against the light instead of with it. He mentioned feeling watched every time he cleaned the 3rd floor corridor directly below the sealed ward. They know I've been digging, he wrote in November 1997. They leave signs for me, warnings. Last night I found a photograph tucked into my mop bucket. It showed a man standing in a doorway, his face obscured by shadow. The door was labeled Room 412. The photograph was dated 1986. The man in the photograph was wearing my uniform. That entry made my skin crawl. Bernard had found a photograph of himself in a room that had been sealed 2 years before he started working at the hospital. How is that possible? I needed to understand these midnight patient transfers. They seemed central to whatever was happening at Greenwood Memorial. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. It was a Tuesday night, just past 1 a.m. I was cleaning the laboratory on the 1st floor when I heard the familiar chime of the East Wing elevator. I immediately set down my mop and moved to the doorway, positioning myself where I could observe without being directly in the path. The elevator doors slid open with a mechanical groan. 2 orderlies emerged, pushing a gurney between them. They moved in perfect synchronization, their footsteps falling at exactly the same moment. Their faces were slack, expressionless, as if the muscles had forgotten how to convey emotion. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and I could see thin blue veins tracing patterns beneath the surface. On the gurney lay a figure covered by a white sheet. I followed Bernard's rules. I kept my eyes on the floor. I did not speak. I barely breathed, but this time, I paid attention to every detail. The orderlies did not walk like normal people. Their movements were too smooth, too fluid, as if they were gliding rather than stepping. Their heads never turned. Their eyes never blinked. As they passed, the temperature plummeted. My breath misted in front of my face, and I felt the cold seeping through my clothes and into my bones. But there was something else, too. A smell. It was faint but unmistakable. The sweet, cloying odor of decay masked by antiseptic. And then I heard it again. From beneath the sheet came a sound. Not a voice this time. A scratching, like fingernails dragging across metal. The sheet twitched. I looked away immediately, pressing my back against the wall and counting my heartbeats until the sound of the gurney's wheels faded down the corridor. When I finally dared to look up, the elevator doors were closing behind them. But I had noticed something. The indicator above the elevator showed the number 4. They were going to the 4th floor. The floor that did not officially exist. The floor whose button had been removed from every elevator panel. Except, apparently, from the service elevator in the East Wing. I stood there for a long moment, trembling. Every instinct told me to forget what I had seen, to go back to mopping floors and emptying trash and pretending that Greenwood Memorial was a normal hospital with normal patients and normal staff. But I could not. The scratching sound echoed in my memory. Something had been alive beneath that sheet. Something I wanted to get out. What were they taking to the 4th floor? And what was waiting for it when it arrived? I found my answer 2 nights later, in the final pages of Bernard's logbook. It was an entry dated December 1998, just days before his writing stopped completely. I have finally understood the purpose of the transfers, he wrote. It took me 11 years, but I now know what is happening on the 4th floor. The patients they take are not patients in the traditional sense. Some are dying. Some are already dead. But all of them share one thing in common. They have seen something they should not have seen. They have heard something they should not have heard. They have broken one of the rules. The 4th floor is not a storage space. It is not an abandoned ward. It is a feeding ground. Dr. Cartwright's experiments did not kill those 15 people. They changed them. They awakened something in them, something hungry and patient, something that has been waiting in the walls and the shadows for 40 years. The transfers are offerings. The hospital has been making bargains to keep itself running. Every soul delivered to the 4th floor buys another year of normalcy, another year of safety. The staff knows. The administrators know. They all know. They just refuse to say it out loud. I closed the logbook with shaking hands. The hospital was feeding people to something. The midnight patient transfers were not medical procedures. They were sacrifices. I thought about the voice I had heard pleading for help. I thought about the scratching beneath the sheet. Those were not volunteers. They were victims delivered to whatever lurked on the 4th floor because they had seen too much, heard too much, known too much. And now I had read Bernard's logbook. I knew everything. How long did I have before they came for me? That night, I walked the corridors with new eyes. I noticed how the staff avoided certain areas. I noticed how conversations stopped when I entered a room. I noticed how Patricia Wells watched me from her office window as I crossed the parking lot. They knew I had found something. They were just waiting to see what I would do next. I made my decision on a cold Thursday evening as I sat in my car outside the hospital. I was not going to run. Running would only confirm their suspicions. It would mark me as a target. Instead, I was going to do something far more dangerous. I was going to find a way to the 4th floor. I needed to see what was up there. I needed to understand what Bernard had discovered. And more importantly, I needed to find proof. Evidence that could expose what Greenwood Memorial was hiding. The stairwell to the 4th floor was sealed with a heavy steel door at the 3rd floor landing. The lock was industrial grade, the kind designed to keep people out of secure facilities. But Bernard's logbook had mentioned a second access point. There's another way up, he had written. Maintenance shaft behind the boiler room. The hospital sealed the main entrance, but they forgot about the old ventilation system. The shaft runs all the way to the 4th floor. I have been too afraid to use it. But if you're reading this and you're braver than I was, that is your path. I was not brave, but I was desperate. And desperation has a way of making cowards into heroes. On Friday night, I brought a flashlight with extra batteries, a small crowbar I had purchased from hardware store, and Bernard's logbook. I told no one where I was going. I left no notes. If something happened to me, I wanted there to be no record of my intentions. The hospital would not be able to cover up my disappearance if I simply vanished without explanation. At 2 a.m, I made my way to the basement. The boiler room was a cavern of pipes and machinery, filled with the constant thrumming of the hospital's mechanical heart. I found a maintenance shaft behind a rusted panel that had not been opened in decades. The shaft was narrow and dark. Cobwebs clung to every surface, and the air smelled stale and forgotten. I began to climb. The ladder rungs were slick with moisture and age, and more than once I felt my hands slip on the corroded metal. Above me, the darkness seemed absolute, swallowing the beam of my flashlight after only a few feet. I climbed for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes. And then I reached a hatch. The hatch was cold to the touch. When I pressed my ear against it, I heard something that made my heart stop. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Pacing back and forth. Back and forth. Back and forth. They were waiting for me. Something on the 4th floor knew I was coming. I should have turned back. Every survival instinct screamed at me to descend the ladder and forget I had ever found this place. But I thought about Bernard Hutchins, who had spent 11 years learning the truth and then disappeared before he could share it. I thought about the voices pleading for help from beneath white sheets. I thought about all the people who had been sacrificed to keep this hospital's secrets buried. I pushed open the hatch, and I climbed into the darkness of the 4th floor. The air on the 4th floor tasted different. That was my first impression as I pulled myself through the maintenance hatch and into a corridor that had not seen human presence in over 3 decades. The atmosphere was thick and stale, carrying the weight of years of abandonment. But beneath the mustiness was something else, something that made my tongue feel coated and wrong. It was like breathing in dust mixed with copper and something organic that I could not identify. I crouched in the darkness, letting my eyes adjust. The flashlight in my hand felt pathetically inadequate against the oppressive blackness that surrounded me. When I finally dared to sweep the beam across my surroundings, I understood why this floor had been sealed. The corridor stretched in both directions, disappearing into shadows that my light could not penetrate. The walls were covered in peeling paint, great curls of institutional green that hung like diseased skin. The floor was littered with debris, overturned chairs, scattered papers yellowed with age, and medical equipment that had been left to rust in the decades since the ward's closure. But it was the doors that commanded my attention. Every door I could see was marked with symbols. They had been carved into the wood, deep gouges that formed patterns I did not recognize. Some looked almost like letters from an alphabet that had never existed. Others were geometric shapes that seemed to twist and shift when I stared at them too long. One door, about 20 feet to my left, bore what appeared to be a handprint pressed into the wood itself, as if someone had pushed against the door with such force that their palm had been permanently imprinted into the surface. The footsteps had stopped the moment I emerged from the hatch. Now there was only silence, the kind of silence that feels aware of you. I pulled Bernard's logbook from my jacket and opened it to the pages describing the 4th floor's layout. His notes were fragmentary, compiled from old blueprints and overheard conversations, but they gave me a rough sense of the ward's geography. The psychiatric wing had contained 40 patient rooms, 2 nurses' stations, a recreation area, and a specialized treatment wing at the far end of the corridor. Room 412 is where it began, Bernard had written. Dr. Cartwright conducted his final experiments there. Whatever he awakened, whatever he created, it started in that room. If there are answers to be found on the 4th floor, they will be in room 412. I checked the numbers on the doors nearest to me. Room 401. Room 403. I needed to go deeper. Every step I took echoed in ways that should have been impossible. The sound bounced off the walls and returned to me changed, distorted, as if the corridor itself was swallowing my footfalls and spitting them back in mockery. I kept my flashlight steady, fighting the urge to swing it wildly at every shadow that seemed to shift in my peripheral vision. The whispers started when I passed room 407. They were soft at first, barely distinguishable from the ringing in my ears. But as I continued walking, they grew clearer. Voices overlapping, speaking in rhythms that did not match human speech. Some were pleading, some were laughing, some were reciting strings of numbers that made no sense. And one voice, clearer than the rest, spoke my name. Ethan. I froze. Ethan Cole. The voice came from behind me. I spun around, flashlight cutting through the darkness. The corridor was empty. The door stood closed. Nothing moved. You came. This time the voice came from above. I looked up and immediately regretted it. Something was clinging to the ceiling. I could not see it clearly. My flashlight seemed unable to illuminate it properly, as if the light was bending around its form. But I could make out the general shape. Humanoid, but wrong. Too many joints in the limbs. A head that seemed to rotate in a direction that head should not rotate. It was smiling. I could not see its face, but I knew it was smiling. I ran. I did not think. I did not plan. I simply turned and ran toward the end of the corridor, toward where room 412 waited. Behind me, I heard a sound like wet fabric tearing, followed by footsteps. Not the slow, measured footsteps I had heard from below. These were rapid, eager. A door appeared on my right. Room 410. I grabbed the handle and threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me. The room was small and bare. A rusted bed frame stood against one wall. A shattered window let in moonlight that painted silver rectangles across the floor. I pressed my back against the door, feeling my heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Silence. Then a knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Little pig, let me in. The voice was not human. It was human words forced through a throat that had not been designed for speech. The syllables came out warped and wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. I did not answer. I did not move. I barely breathed. Another knock. Then another. I can smell your fear, Ethan Cole. It tastes like honey. The door creaked. The handle began to turn. I looked around the room desperately. The window. I could try the window, but I was 4 stories up. The fall would kill me. The bed frame. I grabbed the rusted metal and jammed it against the door handle, wedging it beneath the frame to create a barricade. It was not much, but it was something. The handle stopped turning. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, very clever. Very, very clever. But you cannot hide forever. You're in our house now, and the house always wins. The footsteps retreated. I heard them moving away, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. I stood there for what felt like hours, shaking so badly I could barely hold my flashlight. The room pressed in around me, and for the first time since climbing through that hatch, I truly understood what I got myself into. This was not a haunted hospital. This was something far worse. When I finally felt steady enough to move, I approached the window. The moonlight revealed more of the room's details. Scratches covered every surface, long gouges that had been carved into the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. They formed patterns similar to the symbols on the doors, but more chaotic, more desperate. These were not decorations. They were warnings, or prayers. On the floor near the bed frame, I found something that made my blood freeze. A photograph. It was face down, covered in a layer of dust so thick it almost obscured it entirely. When I picked it up and turned it over, my hands went cold. The photograph showed a group of people standing in a corridor. The corridor outside this room. They wore hospital gowns and pajamas, their faces hollow and exhausted. Behind them stood a man in a white coat, his expression calm and clinical. Dr. William Cartwright. I recognized him from the newspaper clippings Bernard had described. He was exactly as the articles had portrayed him, tall, thin, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. But it was not Cartwright that made me gasp. It was the patients. 12 of them, arranged in a neat row, and every single one of them was looking directly at the camera, directly at me. Their eyes were wrong. Even in the faded black and white photograph, I could see that their eyes were entirely black, as if the pupils had expanded to consume the entire eyeball. They were not looking at the photographer. They were looking at whoever would find this picture decades later. They were looking at me. I shoved the photograph into my pocket and stood up. I needed to keep moving. I needed to find room 412 before whatever had chased me returned. I pressed my ear against the door and listened. Nothing. The corridor outside seemed silent. Carefully, I removed the bed frame and opened the door crack. My flashlight revealed empty hallway. The thing that had pursued me was gone, or at least had retreated somewhere beyond my sight. I stepped back into the corridor and continued toward my destination. Room 411 was empty, its door standing open to reveal a space identical to the one I had hidden in. But room 412 was different. The door was massive, reinforced with steel plates that had been bolted directly into the frame. Multiple locks ran down its length, each one industrial grade, and clearly designed to keep something contained. Unlike the other doors, this one bore no carved symbols. It was simply a barrier, blank and imposing. The strangest thing was the light. A thin strip of yellow light was visible beneath the door, leaking out from whatever waited inside. Someone was in room 412, or something. I approached the door slowly, my flashlight trained on the locks. They were old but well-maintained, which suggested that someone had been accessing this room regularly. The midnight patient transfers. This was where they ended. This was where the gurneys were wheeled. I thought about turning back. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to climb back down the maintenance shaft and pretend I had never found this place. But then I heard it, a voice from inside the room, soft and broken, unmistakably human. Please, someone, anyone, let me out. I recognized that voice. It was Bernard Hutchins, the man who had written the logbook, the man who had documented the rules, the man who had disappeared in December 1998. He was still alive, trapped behind this door for over 20 years. I stared at the locks, my mind racing. Bernard had written that locked rooms should never be opened. He had warned that the screams were baked. But this was different. This was not some anonymous cry for help. This was the man whose writings had led me here. The man who had tried to expose the truth. I could not leave him. I began to work on the locks. The first lock took nearly 10 minutes to break. The crowbar I had brought was barely adequate for the job, and my hand was shaking so badly that I kept losing my grip. The entire time I worked, Bernard's voice drifted through the door, weak and pleading. Please hurry. They come back every night. They take things from me. Pieces. I don't have much left. I did not ask what he meant by pieces. I was not sure I wanted to know. The second lock was more stubborn. The metal was corroded, fused together by years of neglect. I had to brace my foot against the door frame and pull with all my strength before the mechanism finally gave way with a grinding screech that echoed down the corridor. 3 more locks remained. By the time I reached the 4th lock, I had lost all sense of time. The darkness pressed in around me, and the whispers had returned, hovering at the edge of my perception. But I ignored them. I focused entirely on the task at hand. When the final lock fell away, I stood before the door for a long moment, gathering my courage. Then I pushed it open. The room beyond was not what I expected. It was clean, spotlessly, impossibly clean, as if someone had scrubbed every surface within the last hour. The walls were white, unmarked by the decay that plagued the rest of the floor. Medical equipment lined the perimeter, monitors for stands, and machines whose purpose I could not identify. In the center of the room stood a single bed. On the bed lay a man. He was ancient. His skin had the texture of crumpled paper, stretched over bones that seemed too prominent, too sharp. His hair was white and wispy, barely clinging to his scalp covered in age spots. But his eyes, when they turned to look at me, were bright and aware. "You came," he said. His voice was the same voice I had heard through the door, but seeing its source made it somehow more terrible. After all this time, someone finally came. Bernard. I stepped into the room, my flashlight lowering as the overhead lights, somehow still functional, illuminated everything. Bernard Hutchins? What's left of him? He tried to smile, but the expression was grotesque on his wasted face. I wrote those rules to help whoever came after me. Did you find my logbook? I nodded, pulling the battered notebook from my jacket and holding it up. I found it. I read everything. Then you know what this place is. His eyes drifted to the ceiling, and I realized with horror that he was looking at something I could not see. You know what they are. The patient for 1986, I said. The ones who disappeared during Cartwright's experiments. They didn't disappear. Bernard's voice dropped to a whisper. They changed. Cartwright was trying to open a door between our world and somewhere else. He succeeded, but he couldn't control what came through. It took the patients first, then the staff, then Cartwright himself. They're all still here. All of them. They've been here for 40 years, feeding on whoever the hospital sends them. The midnight transfers. Sacrifices. Bernard nodded weakly. The hospital made a deal. 1 soul per month in exchange for peace. They deliver the victims through the service elevator, wheel them right to this room, and then they leave. They don't stay to watch what happens next. I felt sick. What happens next? Bernard's eyes filled with something that might have been tears, if he had enough moisture left in his body to produce them. They feed, not on flesh, on essence, on everything that makes you who you are. Memories, emotions, your sense of self. They consume it piece by piece until there's nothing left but an empty shell. That's what they did to me. That's what they've been doing for 27 years. But you're still alive, I said. You're still conscious. You're still you. Barely. He lifted one skeletal hand, and I saw that his fingers were not fingers anymore. They had fused together, the skin merging into something that looked almost like wax. They're keeping me alive because I know things. I wrote everything down. I documented their patterns, their weaknesses, their rules. As long as that knowledge exists in my head, they can't fully consume me. They need to know if anyone else learned what I learned. My blood ran cold. They've been waiting for someone to find your logbook. Yes. They wanted me to come here. Yes. This was a trap. Yes. I spun toward the door, but it was too late. The corridor beyond had changed. The peeling paint and debris were gone, replaced by pristine white walls that stretched into infinity. The doors that had lined the hallway had multiplied, hundreds of them now, each one identical, each one slightly ajar. And from behind those doors came the sounds. Screams, laughter, whispers, pleading, all of it blending together into a cacophony that seemed to vibrate through my skull. You should have followed the rules, Bernard said behind me. Rule 19. Never open a locked room, regardless of what you hear. The screams are bait. You called for help, I said, turning back to face him. You asked me to let you out. That wasn't me. His face twisted with grief. That was them, using my voice. They've been practicing for decades. They can sound like anyone. They can make you hear exactly what you need to hear to make you open the door. The things wearing Bernard's voice had lured me here, and now I was trapped. The lights in room 412 began to flicker. The medical equipment hummed with sudden energy, displays lighting up with readings that made no sense. The temperature dropped rapidly, and I could see my breath misting in front of my face. Something was coming. There's still time, Bernard said urgently. There's still a way out. But you have to listen to me. You have to follow the rules exactly. What rules? I was panicking now, my eyes darting between the infinite corridor and the dying man on the bed. Your logbook didn't say anything about how to escape. I never wrote down the final rule. Bernard's voice was growing weaker. I was too afraid that if I put it on paper, they would find a way around it. But you need to know now. The flickering lights began to pulse rhythmically, and I could hear footsteps in the corridor. Many footsteps, approaching from every direction. Rule 23, Bernard whispered. The only rule that matters. If you find yourself trapped on the 4th floor, there is one path to safety. You must find the original door, the one Cartwright used to open the passage between worlds. It's in the treatment wing at the very end of the hall. The door is marked with a symbol, a circle with 7 points. If you can reach it, if you can close it properly, everything that came through will be pulled back. The 4th floor will become empty again. The feeding will stop. How do I close it? The door requires a sacrifice. Bernard's eyes met mine, and I saw the weight of 27 years of suffering reflected in them. A willing sacrifice. Someone has to step through and pull it shut from the other side. I understood immediately. I've been waiting so long. A tear finally escaped, trailing down his papery cheek. They kept me alive because they needed my knowledge. But if you take me to that door, if you help me reach it, I can end this. All of it. The footsteps were getting closer. I could see shadows now, moving at the edges of the corridor, shapes that defied natural geometry. We have to go now, I said. I helped Bernard out of the bed, supporting his frail body against my shoulder. He weighed almost nothing, as if the creatures of the 4th floor had consumed even his physical substance over the decades. Together, we stumbled toward the door. The corridor had become a labyrinth. Doors opened and closed around us, revealing glimpses of horrors I cannot describe. Rooms filled with bodies that still moved, walls covered in writing that seemed to shift and crawl, faces that pressed against surfaces that should have been solid. But Bernard knew the way. Despite his weakness, despite everything that had been done to him, he guided me through the maze with certainty. Left here, through that door. No, not that one, the one with the rust stains. The things in the corridor followed us, but did not attack. They kept their distance, watching, waiting. Perhaps they were curious. Perhaps they were toying with us. Perhaps they already knew how this would end. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the treatment wing. The door was exactly as Bernard had described. Ancient wood reinforced with iron bands, bearing a symbol that made my eyes hurt to look at directly. A circle with 7 points, carved so deeply into the surface that it seemed to go all the way through. And beyond the door, I could feel something pulling at me, a gravitational force that tugged at my consciousness, trying to draw me forward. This is it, Bernard said. This is the door Cartwright opened, the door that started everything. The creatures behind us had stopped advancing. They stood in a silent semicircle, their forms flickering and shifting in the unstable light. For the first time, I could see them clearly. They were not monsters, not in the traditional sense. They were people, patients and staff from 1986, their features distorted and wrong, but still recognizably human. They had been twisted by their journey through the door, changed into something that no longer belonged to our world. And at their center stood a figure in a white coat. Dr. William Cartwright. You think you can close what I opened? His voice was calm, almost amused. This door has been feeding us for 40 years. It will continue to feed us for 40 more. And then 40 after that. You cannot stop progress. You cannot stop evolution. Bernard looked at me one final time. Remember the rules, Ethan. When I step through, pull the door closed behind me. Do not hesitate. Do not look back. Just close the door and run. Bernard, I wrote those rules to protect people like you. People who stumble into darkness without meaning to. Let me protect you one last time. Before I could respond, Bernard Hutchins pulled himself free of my grip and threw himself toward the door. Bernard hit the door with all the momentum his wasted body could muster. The ancient wood swung inward, revealing a void of absolute darkness that seemed to breathe. For a single moment, I saw beyond the threshold, shapes moving in distances that should not exist, geometries that made my mind recoil in self-defense. Then Bernard stepped through. Now, his voice echoed from somewhere beyond the door, already growing distant. "Close it now." I grabbed the iron handle and pulled. The resistance was immense. The door fought me, as if the void behind it was alive and determined to remain open. The creatures in the corridor screamed, a sound that was equal parts rage and terror. They surged forward, reaching for me with hands that were not entirely hands, grasping with fingers that bent in impossible directions. But I held on. I pulled with every ounce of strength I possessed, my muscles screaming, my vision blurring with effort. The door moved inch by inch, fighting me the entire way. And then, just as the first creature was about to reach me, I felt a push from the other side. Bernard was helping, even from within the void, even as he was being consumed by whatever waited there. He was pushing the door closed. The gap narrowed. The screaming intensified. The creatures clawed at the remaining opening, trying to force their way through before it sealed completely. And then the door slammed shut. The impact threw me backward, sending me sprawling across the floor of the treatment wing. The symbol on the door flared with a blinding light that forced me to shield my eyes. When I lowered my hands, the fourth floor had changed. The infinite corridors were gone, replaced by the decayed hallway I had first entered through. The creatures that had pursued me had vanished, leaving behind only faint scorched marks on the floor where they had stood. The whispers that had plagued me since I arrived had fallen silent, and the door that had caused so much suffering was no longer there. In its place was a blank wall, as if the doorway had never existed at all. I lay there for a long time, unable to move, unable to process what had happened. Bernard Hutchins, after 27 years of captivity, had finally found his escape. He had sacrificed himself to close the door that should never have been opened. When I finally climbed to my feet, I noticed something on the floor near where the door had been. A photograph. I picked it up, my hand still shaking. It showed Bernard Hutchins in his prime, wearing the same uniform I wore now, standing in front of Greenwood Memorial Hospital with a smile on his face. On the back, in faded handwriting, was a message. To whoever finishes what I started, thank you. The rules will keep you safe. Just remember the most important one. Sometimes, the only way to win is to stop playing the game. Walk away while you still can. B.H. I pocketed the photograph and made my way back to the maintenance shaft. The climb down was easier than the climb up. My body moved on autopilot, my mind still processing the impossibility of what I had witnessed. When I finally emerged in the boiler room, the first rays of dawn were creeping through the basement windows. I had survived, but my ordeal was not over. When I arrived at the main floor, Patricia Wells was waiting for me. She stood in the corridor near the lobby, her pale gray eyes fixed on the stairwell door. Her expression was unreadable, but I could see the tension in her posture, the way her hands were clasped too tightly in front of her. "Mr. Cole," she said, "you were on the fourth floor." It was not a question. I was. "And you closed the door." "I did." She studied me for a long moment. I could not tell if she was relieved or furious. Perhaps both. "The fourth floor was our arrangement," she finally said. "For 40 years, it kept this hospital safe. One sacrifice per month in exchange for peace. No one explained deaths. No mysterious disappearances among the general staff. No chaos. Just order. You were feeding people to those things. I was protecting the majority by sacrificing the few." Her voice was cold, but not cruel. Every administrator before me made the same choice. Every administrator after me would have made it too. That is how institutions survive, through difficult decisions made by people willing to carry the weight. I thought about Bernard Hutchins, trapped in that room for 27 years. I thought about the voices pleading from beneath white sheets. I thought about all the victims who had been wheeled to the fourth floor and never returned. It's over now, I said. The door is closed. Whatever was feeding on this hospital is gone. Patricia Wells smiled, and for the first time, I saw genuine emotion in her eyes. It was not anger or fear. It was resignation. Yes, she said. It is. The fourth floor has been purged. The midnight transfers will stop. This hospital will have to find a new way to survive. She turned and walked toward her office, pausing at the door to look back at me. You should know that the consequences of your actions will unfold slowly. The things you banished did not only feed on sacrifices. They fed on pain, on fear, on suffering of all kinds. This hospital has been their sanctuary for 40 years. Without them, the balance has shifted. Patients will die who would have lived. Staff will suffer in ways they never have before. You have removed a horror, Mr. Cole, but you have also removed a stabilizing force. I hope you are prepared for what comes next. She disappeared into her office, leaving me alone in the corridor. I stood there for a long time, thinking about her words. She was trying to make me doubt what I had done, trying to paint the creatures of the fourth floor as necessary evils. But I knew better. Some evils are never necessary. Some doors are meant to stay closed. I quit my job at Greenwood Memorial Hospital that morning. I packed my locker, turned in my keys, and walked out without looking back. But before I left, I did one final thing. I took Bernard's logbook to the local newspaper office and left it on the editor's desk with a note explaining what it contained. I do not know if they believed me. I do not know if they investigated or dismissed the whole thing as the ravings of a disturbed janitor. But I had to try. The truth deserved to be told, even if no one was willing to listen. It has been 6 months since that night. I have moved to a different state, taken a different job, built a different life. But I still think about Greenwood Memorial. I still dream about the infinite corridors and the faces pressing against doors that should have been locked. I still hear whispers sometimes, late at night, when the silence gets too deep. And I still follow the rules. Not Bernard's rules specifically, but rules in general. I have learned that the world is full of boundaries that exist for reasons we do not understand. Some are meant to be questioned. Some are meant to be broken. But others, the ones that feel wrong in ways we cannot explain, the ones that make our instincts scream even when our minds cannot articulate why, those rules are meant to be followed. Because behind every rule, there is a story. And behind some stories, there are horrors we are not meant to survive. If you ever find yourself working the night shift at a hospital in Vermont, if you ever discover a hidden logbook filled with warnings, if you ever hear your name called from an empty room, remember what I have told you. The rules exist for a reason. Follow them. And whatever you do, never open a locked door. No matter how desperately the voice on the other side begs you to help. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Some doors are meant to stay closed. And some floors should remain forever abandoned. The end.